Chapter 5, First Day on the Job. Gareth Hope quietly eased open the door to the announcer's office and crept inside. Announcers didn't work nights, so he wasn't tag teaming with anyone else. It was just him, slipping like a pale ghost inside the door just before 6 a.m. His long hair swung around his ears as he turned at the doorway and surveyed the scene before him. It was amazing. No other word for it. There was this tiny ball of black and white fluff on the reddish pink carpet that he knew so well, the tiniest little thing. And it was moving. It was alive. The kitten was just wandering around the office, having been at the station for less than 24 hours, and was clearly still quite confused and trying to take it all in. His white plastic food bowl dwarfed him. He was so small. Gareth almost couldn't believe his eyes. "Hello, station cat," he whispered. For a long time, he just stood in the doorway staring at the little creature. After all his campaigning, all his eager enthusiasm and blustering banter, one of his ideas had actually come off. He had achieved something. And now the kitten was before him, living, breathing proof that when Gareth put his mind to something, he really could make things happen, no matter how much he might doubt himself at times. Gareth bent down to say hello, and the kitten, naturally inquisitive, though still somewhat timid, trotted over to sniff out this newcomer with caution. Gareth let the cat's velvety black nose fully investigate his hand before pressing his fingers firmly into the kitten's fluffy black fur and giving him a friendly stroke. "Hello, I'm Gareth," he said cheerily. "I've been waiting a long, long time to meet you, little cat." The announcer's office had a window that looked out onto platform 1, and Gareth could see, even as he crouched on the carpet next to the cat, that the platforms were already filling up with morning commuters. Soon the early trains to Manchester and Leeds and York would be pulling into the station, and Gareth needed to be ready to announce them. But he didn't want to say goodbye to his new friend just yet. So he scooped him up and placed him on the desk where he worked. The workspace had a keyboard, 4 large screens showing both the train's arrivals and the CCTV images, and a black freestanding microphone for making announcements, as well as the usual office detritus, a computer mouse, a few pens, a clipboard for making notes, and a telephone. The kitten padded about on the desktop as Gareth settled himself in his chair, and then curled right up, right on top of the keyboard, his bottom on the keys and his head on the desk, and fell fast asleep. Gareth chuckled to himself. It was just as he imagined. The kitten was only 8 weeks old and had been at the station for less than a day, and he was already taking over. Gareth couldn't bear to disturb him, so he worked as little as possible, it must be said, around the sleeping form throughout that very first morning rush hour that the station cat was on duty. If anyone came to the window with an inquiry, he would gently lift the kitten, who fitted into the palm of one of his hands, into his cupped hand, and carry him over to where he could more easily assist the customer, not wanting to let the little animal out of his sight even for an instant. Those first customers to catch a glimpse of the kitten were naturally somewhat surprised to see a railway man bringing a snoozing moggy to the window, but Gareth barely registered their reaction. He had eyes only for the new station cat, and spent most of the shift cuddling him or watching him as the kitten once again adopted what was fast becoming a favourite position, hugging the computer keyboard with a paw stretched out across it. Seeing him shiver, Gareth scurried to get a blanket and draped it around the ball of fur before returning to his obsessive observation of every slumbering sigh, whisker wriggle and tail twitch as the cat snoozed away the hours. And that was how Angie Hunt found them when she clocked on for her shift that day. As soon as she locked eyes on the kitten, it was love at first sight. She fell hook, line and sinker for this little creature, and as Angie herself put it, There was no work done that day whatsoever. Everything was just second best that day. Gareth and Angie couldn't stop staring at him. He was possibly the fluffiest cat they'd ever seen, totally gorgeous. He had ebony black fur, but his bib, paws and belly were the snowiest white. His belly was almost all white, they realised, except for a black splodge just below his heart. White too were the inner tufts of his pointy ears, while his tail had just a smidgen of silver to it at the very, very tip. He was so small that when curled in a ball atop the keyboard, he still left Gareth plenty of room to type softly around him, for he occupied only the space from the return key to the letter V. Angie, who had grown up with cats but hadn't had the pleasure of caring for one in over 25 years, felt blessed. To be given responsibility for this wondrous little creature felt very, very special indeed. I can't believe we've got him, she breathed softly to Gareth. I never thought in a million years we'd actually get one. As the kitten dozed and Angie and Gareth fussed over him, they also assessed the larger surrounding of the announcer's office. Given the small contingent of anti-cat folk on the team, neither Angie nor Gareth wanted to give a colleague any excuse to complain. So they covered the floor with newspaper, and just as well, for it turned out that the kitten was a rather messy eater and drinker, and he was not yet used to his new bowls at the station. Both food and water would get everywhere when he dined. Just as his mother Lexi had taught him, however, he was very good about using the litter tray laid out for him, and very few accidents occurred. Whether in the litter tray or elsewhere, the kitten's mess was cleaned up instantly to make sure it didn't disturb anyone in the office who might have an axe to grind. The kitten slept for most of Gareth's shift that first day, but he was awake for a little bit, blinking those kitten blue eyes at his new friend. And Gareth decided, looking at the way the creature's eyes fixed firmly on him, that what the kitten really needed in this new home of his, that was in many ways so transient, with people coming and going on shifts all the time, was a permanent friend to call his own. Leaving Angie gazing adoringly at the kitten, he went to knock on the door of the Lost Property Office. "Hiya, Gareth," cried the woman in charge of it cheerily. She was called Angela Dunn, a friendly lady with short blonde hair and shaded glasses, known for being both practical and kind-hearted. Gareth subtly scanned the shelves behind her in the office. They were filled with a rather sad-looking collection of abandoned umbrellas and left-behind bags, forgotten coats and jumpers, and much more besides. The loneliest of all the items, though, were the lost property toys. They sat morosely on the shelves, their beaded eyes dull and blank, their once much-loved woolen bodies misshapen and worn, never to be hugged again by their owners, many of whom were now grown up. There were bunnies and teddies and soft brown bears, dolls and ducks and dinosaurs. Angela kept them as long as she was able to, hoping to facilitate a reunion with a child and its favourite drop toy. But more often than not, the months and then years would pass by, and eventually, as the office grew too full, Angela would gather up the long-lost items with a sad sigh, and they'd be redistributed to charity, where she hoped they would find another loving home. "I was wondering," said Gareth, looking hopefully at Angela, "is there a cuddly toy we could give to the cat?" Angela smiled affectionately at him. The lost property lady was definitely a pro-cat enthusiast, and she had already fallen for their little ball of fluff. "Let me see now," she mused aloud. "I'm sure there's something we can do." From the rows of toys who had been abandoned longest, she and Gareth picked out a pale, brown, cuddly bear. The kitten was so tiny that the bear was about the same size as him on that very first day, but they knew that as he grew older, the pair would be well matched. The bear was made of a fleecy material, a light, malleable creature who could sit upright and be safely chewed and loved. Gareth thanked Angela for her help, then went to introduce the bear to his new best friend. The kitten gazed quizzically at it for a second and gave it a good sniff all over and a little taste with his rough pink tongue. Then he curled up right next to it and fell asleep, his head tucked into the bear's neck, looking as happy as Larry and just as content as if he was snuggled next to Luther or Spadge or Max or Percy, the siblings with whom he had spent his first 8 weeks. "There you go," said Gareth tenderly. "That's better, isn't it?" It was some hours later, as acting station manager Andy Krugum was clocking on for the night shift, that the manager paused outside the door to the announcer's office, little knowing what he would find inside. Andy had been off on holiday for a few days, so he was utterly confused by the sign the team had put pinned on the door. "Please be careful when you open this door." "What's going on here?" Andy thought in confusion. "Why do I have to be careful?" And then, as he eased open the door, he saw exactly why. This being night time, the nocturnal kitten appeared to have woken up and was ready to party. As Andy eased the door open and looked ahead of him into the room, a tiny dark flash shot past him, chasing a ball of paper that Gareth had thrown. The kitten was darting around like a mad thing, tumbling over his legs and paws, even his own head, just as he had once done at the Briscoes. He shot across the room, then hid under the table with a squeaky little meow, observing the newcomer from his place of safety. "Oh my God," thought Andy, "the cat! We've got the cat!" He peered more closely at the ball of fluff, but all he could see were massive ears and massive eyes amid the downy ebony fur. Ears which were way too big for the kitten, but the perfect size for the cat he would become. Andy shook his head in disbelief and then heard a giggling noise coming from the announcer's chair. Gareth was sitting there sheepishly, just giggling to himself, an irrepressible burble of joy that burst forth. It was hard to control that kind of happiness. Andy found himself smiling back at his colleague and long-term partner in crime. "We did it," Gareth cried, leaping from his chair and offering his palm for Andy to high-five. "All those crazy ideas, and we actually pulled one off." Andy, somewhat self-consciously, as he wasn't keen on high-fives, smacked at the proffered palm and gave himself up to the grin. Gareth was right. They had done it. There was only one tiny niggle dampening the announcer's happiness. The cat had arrived. They had approval from head office. Everything should have been grand. But Gareth couldn't help but recall how many times Paul, the former station manager, had said no to him when he begged and chivied for a cat. And although Andy, acting up, had greenlit the idea, Huddersfield was still Paul's station. He was only absent on secondment. He hadn't resigned. And that secondment, as Gareth was horribly aware, was coming to an end in about 1 week's time. Then Andy would be demoted and Paul would once more be in charge. The station cat had landed. It was true. He was here, and Gareth was stroking him and cuddling him and laughing at his funny little antics. And there was a nervousness to those giggles despite his joy, because a growing terror at the back of Gareth's mind now started gnawing at him. He pictured Paul coming back onto the concourse, heading to the office, opening the door and seeing the cat curled up on the keyboard. What if his manager took one look at the kitten and said brusquely, "It's got to go." Chapter 6, What's in a Name? "Morning, gorgeous," cried Angie Hunt with even more verve than usual. She had a real spring in her step as she walked into the announcer's office on day 2 of the station cat's tenure. Somehow, getting up at 4:45 that morning hadn't been an issue in the slightest. She'd bounded out of bed knowing that when she got to work, she'd get to see her cat. The early mornings somehow just weren't going to bother her anymore. It was now an undiluted pleasure to come to work. Billy rolled his eyes as he prepared to hand over to Angie for her shift. "Good morning, Mrs. H," he said dryly. She batted at him playfully, knowing he was pulling her leg. "I wasn't talking to you, Mr. Grumpy. I was talking to my kitten." Said kitten was watching this exchange with eager eyes, all from the viewpoint of his new favourite haunt, the top tier of the team leader's in tray, stuffed with paperwork and with its metal edges curved up like a hammock. He found it an immensely comfy spot, perfect for catching a few Zeds and for watching the world go by. The kitten's world, for the foreseeable future, was solely the domain of the announcer's office. Kittens cannot start their inoculations until they're 9 weeks old, and these usually take the form of a double jab, one at 9 weeks and one at 12 weeks. So until that point, to be on the safe side, it is best to keep them indoors. Given the location of this particular kitten's home too, it was a nicer and safer way to ease him into his life on the railway. Though occasionally the muted thrum of a train's engine or the squeal of its brakes could be heard from a distance through the window, on the whole, the office was a much more peaceful and domestic place than the concourse, though of course the attraction of the cat itself made the office at times busier than Clapham Junction. "Has he been any trouble?" Angie asked Billy as the old-timer prepared to head off home. Billy turned at the door with his hands in his pockets and scowled. "Trouble?" he echoed tetchily. "Trouble? Too right he's been trouble. Look at where he's sitting, on my paperwork, all night long." He kept muttering grumpily to himself under his breath as he cautiously opened the door to let himself out. Despite his hearty moans, Angie couldn't help but notice that he was being awfully careful to ensure that he didn't give the kitten a chance to escape, though he couldn't resist a huffy slam of the door as he exited. "Have you been winding Mr. Grumpy up?" she quizzed the kitten. He cocked his little black head to one side and stuck his pink tongue out cheekily as if to say, "Yes, I have." Angie got her bits and pieces together, picking up the cat partly to give him a cuddle, but also because she needed the very bit of paper the kitten was lying on. That Billy, she mused wryly to herself. He could moan for England, it was true, but it hadn't escaped Angie that for all his cantankerous words, he hadn't actually moved the kitten from his comfy place of rest. Billy, despite the toughened exterior and his prickly ways, was a big old softy at heart, though he wouldn't like her saying so. Though Billy didn't have the heart to move the kitten, as the shift continued and Martin, Huddersfield's other announcer, arrived for work, Angie discovered there were some colleagues who were not so susceptible to the kitten's many charms. When Martin pulled his chair up at his desk and readjusted his thick glasses on his nose, he looked down to discover the kitten draped across the keyboard, as was now his wont. Martin shook his head. All was not right with his world. He cleared his throat and spoke awkwardly to the cat. "You can't stay there," he told him. "Come on, get down." When the kitten didn't move so much as an inch, Martin reached out and closed his hesitant hands around the little body before lifting him up. He placed him down on the carpet, from where the kitten looked up at him quizzically, his bright eyes drinking him in. "Go on with you now," Martin said. "I've got to do some work." But the kitten kept watching him, as though Martin was the most fascinating creature on the planet. Only when Martin shooed him away did he scamper off thinking it was a new game, before darting round the office at full speed. For the kitten, everything was a new game. And there were certainly plenty of opportunities for fun. As the cat grew more comfortable with his surroundings, he grew more daring. The office furniture became an obstacle course for jumping and leaping upon in 3 easy bounds. He could dart from the floor to the squishy seat of an office chair, up onto the narrow beam of the chair's arm, and then the big finish, from his tippy toes onto the beam to the crash mat of the desk, which had a perfect surface for skidding and sliding on, just as a rock and roll star might do. The larger pieces of equipment, meanwhile, provided handy nooks and crannies for countless games of hide and seek. The skyscraper-like sides of the photocopy giving the kitten a safe cityscape to run and play and hide in. and the cat had no shortage of playmates. It wasn't long before all 26 people on the TPE team at Huddersfield had met him, not to mention the staff from other train companies who also ran services out of the station. Everybody wanted to play with the railway cat. It was understandably a little overwhelming for the kitten at times, with each new colleague to whom he was introduced. He would at first be timid and shy. Soon, however, he began acquiring favourites. Jean Randall, who worked in the booking office, was one. Her philosophy with animals was that, as you've chosen the animal to come and live with you, and they didn't choose you, you have a duty to make their life as lovely as possible. A cuddle with Jean, whose curly black hair was almost a mirror image of the kitten's fluffy dark fur, soon became a highlight of his day. But Jean worked in the booking office, where the team were locked in for security reasons, and the cat burglar kitten wasn't allowed in either. So those cuddles had to happen before or after Jean's shifts, or for a snatched 5 minutes on her coffee break. The kitten spent far more time with Gareth, sleeping on his lap for the announcer's entire shift, or with the team leaders than with anyone else. And so these people became his closest family and friends. The brown bear, too, was a constant companion, though it was a bit of a struggle for the kitten on account of its size. He'd tenderly clamp his jaws around its arm or leg so that he could drag it around everywhere he went. With the kitten settling in brilliantly, the next pressing issue was his name. Gareth turned again to his trusty computer and rustled up a new station cat poster, one he never thought he'd be in the position to create. Huddersfield Station Cat. Here's your chance to name Huddersfield Station's latest recruit. Only 50p a go. Write down your name and your suggestion for the cat's name, and it will be drawn from a hat on Tuesday, the 19th of July. Well, commented Angie, we couldn't call him Kitten forever and a day. There was a great excitement at the station about the competition. It wasn't open to customers, but as is tradition on the railway network, they put the word out far and wide, wanting as many people as possible to get involved. All proceeds from the naming competition were going to save the children, so the more people who entered, the more funds the kitten would raise for this very worthy cause. Almost everyone entered, and Belinda Graham even took some entry slips down to the TPE headquarters at Bridgewater House in Manchester, where the team there made their own contribution to the station's cat history.